Hello, my name is Justin Bright, and welcome to Kerbal Space Program version 1.8.1 in my next small step RP-1 career mode playthrough. And we are now actually in progress with a mission at the end of it at this point. This is the Gemini 7L mission that went around the moon, and the mission on the tin was to do the single crewed lunar orbit, which we have completed, and that's just, you know, a get around the moon and hang out for 20 hours and then come back home. So we are in the midst of doing that, but the real reason why we came here was I just finished with the dress rehearsal of our crewed lunar landing. However, it is almost like the actual lunar landing mission is going to be almost identical to it, and I didn't want to do the same mission like twice in a row, and one with lower stakes and then one with slightly higher stakes. That seemed a little bit silly. So what I've done is I've basically accomplished this mission on my own, and this is really cool watching the globe of the moon recede here. And what I've done during that is we made it all happen. We did the mission, and I'll show you the profile, and I'll tell you where it differs when we do the follow-up. But it worked okay, and I learned a lot about how to actually conduct a landing and efficiently use a low thrust-to-weight ratio engine on descent. And there will be some new tricks and trials with the actual production line version of this mission when we finally get that done. But that should be coming next. That's the very next thing that I'm going to do. So we're not going to repeat the same mission twice in a row. That's not very fun. So we're just going to finish up this one as I kind of talk about what happened and what I've learned. So we are just entering the Earth sphere of influence and coming down from our orbit. We have, in this one, I didn't actually do any science. I forgot to actually deploy any of my science when I had my lander landed, but everything else has worked out okay. The amount of buffer I have on this mission is approximately none, so I'm going to be changing the profile from what I thought I was going to be doing, where we are going to enter into a much lower orbit. And that's kind of the key difference that I've learned in doing this mission, and also the difficulties of rendezvous with a lunar landing module that barely has any fuel. So lots of interesting things that I've learned and put together, but Johnny Flores and Stanley Wood, they are here on the mission that is essentially Apollo 10, which was the dress rehearsal for the Apollo lunar landing for the subsequent Apollo 11 mission. But instead of having the crew jump into the lunar descent module and then go into a descent orbit and then come back up and redock, I instead executed the entire landing operation with both of the crew still up in the orbital service module, and the lunar landing module was completely unmanned and had an avionics that supported such a thing. So that is in general what I did, and that is what the difference was between this and what the actual mission is going to be. But yeah, so that's the difference is going to be that, you know, we're actually going to do the whole thing this time, and there's going to be some small tweaks based on what I've learned. I need to make sure that I have enough fuel to land and also to get back into orbit, for example. So I may have to tweak a couple little things on the tanks of our lunar lander, but yeah, that is about it for that, and we are just about now to hit the atmosphere of Earth. So it's time to just go ahead, and we're going to point straight down and kick off this, kick off our service module that is no longer necessary. Got electric charge and everything else that we need, so off we go. Track this antenna, surface velocity minus. And there we go. our indexing key and all that. And all right, so yeah, now it is just time to re-enter, and we are coming in. I'm basically going to just turn off the control, and then I'm just going to kind of use manual rolling around. Man, that is really close for comfort. Good lord. Oh, we are swinging wildly off here, and we need to turn descent mode on too. Off pitch. There, just turn off the smartass so that we can control our descent basically manually at this point, and not spend as much fuel as I have been. Because the aerodynamics of the capsule should handle it at this point. And yes, indeed, a nice easy re-entry. We are still at 9 kilometers per second, but this is not that much of a problem. So yeah, the Apollo 10 mission was John Young, Thomas Stafford, and Gene Cernan that went into an orbit that was fairly similar. Oh, I am going up like a whole bunch. I need to turn off descent mode. So actually, what I'm going to do at this point, surface velocity minus, roll 180 degrees. And descent mode back on. Once we stabilize, I will turn off smartass once again to hopefully we're not going to bounce back out of the atmosphere. I should have been watching that a little more closely. But yeah, it's those 3 astronauts that flew around the moon on a basically entirely standard mission profile for Apollo, the same one that they would essentially use for Apollo 11. However, they deliberately, as I understand it, underfueled the vessel, the lunar module, I believe, so that they would not just you know what, screw it, let's just go down to the moon. So I'm pretty sure they did something like that to make sure that the those daring astronauts didn't go out of line and do the lunar landing 1 mission early. Yeah, so I bounced myself up, not entirely out of the atmosphere, but up to 81 kilometer apogee, and we're gonna see what that does to my what do you call it? To the G loads that we suffer on the way down. But I think this is actually a pretty common re-entry trajectory, having that little bit of a bounce to shed off a whole bunch of velocity in the upper atmosphere before you come back down. Yeah, so I've just verified that the ascent stage of the lunar landing module was loaded with only about half of the fuel that it would require to lift off from the surface of the moon, which meant that there was no way that they could, in fact, do what they needed to do on the surface to, they couldn't land on the surface and then come back. Like, if they did that, they would not have enough, but they had plenty to perform their mission profile, more than enough, but they just wanted to make sure, according to Craig Nelson in his book Rocket Men, that they wouldn't, the astronauts wouldn't just go for it. All right, so we are getting a pretty heavy amount of G load, so I'm going to turn on descent mode and try to bounce us up a little bit more, or slow my vertical descent here, because I bounced up, but then I didn't do enough to control my descent once again. But yeah, and it's not great for Stanley Wood here. But there we go. We have gotten that done, and we have landed astronauts a couple times, so I am now just going to warp down to the recovery. All right, and here we are, just about to touch down on the mountains, apparently. Oop, and there we go. Very, very nice. Not do a... I guess I don't have any... Yeah, no science whatsoever. Can't even do a crew report here. But that's fine. So yeah, we have returned Johnny Flores and Stanley Wood safely. And before we get to our moon landing launch, let's wrap up with the Martian moon hopper, which has finished its last batch of science, having vacuumed up all of the basic science at my particular level on Phobos. So, or Deimos. No, Phobos, yes. That is where I am. I was thinking about going back to Deimos, but for now, let's just try to get back up to our orbiter. So we have plenty of delta V, plenty of power, so let's just lift off very nicely. And now I'm just kind of tweaking my orbit here so that I can hopefully reach up to our spacecraft, our orbiter spacecraft, and here's how we're going to do this. So I'm just going to jump straight up in very silly fashion. And there we go. We're going to have a separation of 0 with a relative velocity of 7 meters per second, which sounds just fine. So all that requires of us is to just hop straight up. Jumping up over the craggy surface of Phobos, leaving this tiny Martian potato for the last time. Well, at least for this mission. And just keeping an eye on our orbiter, which is coming up even as we speak. And here we go. It is coming right along. And here we are. So yeah, now it's just should, in theory, be a very easy docking. I actually have fuel left, so I don't have to do that interstellar style docking that I did before. Ah, how freaking cool. Man, Mars is so neat. Oh dear, that spacecraft is tumbling though. And there we go. We have halted our relative velocity. Open up the docking alignment indicator. Switch over to part negative. Switch over to this and say kill rotation. It is just pointing backwards towards the sun, which is where we're going to leave it, so that seems just fine. Alright, so we are coming in for a docking, just canceling out our relative velocity and aligning ourselves perfectly in front of their docking port, with Mars there in the background. Quickly now. Here we go. RCS on this thing is very zippy, so that works just fine. And there we go, and push forward. The end. Alright, turning off smartass and just allowing and moving in at 0.08 meters per second for the final bit of the docking, and the magnets should take care of us being slightly misaligned there. There we go. Oh dear. And there we go. So we are all docked up and ready to roll. Let's kill that rotation. And we are just going to soak up the sun. So we have now another 30 days of science that we can do here in orbit of Phobos. So we actually have a couple of different science experiments that we can do up here. Orbital perturbation is a little bit long for what I'm looking to do, but we should be able to get micrometeorite and magnetic scan 2 complete here, and that will be wonderful. So let's plan to do that. And yeah, I may have to come back to this one a couple more times, because this is, I want to say, space high, so we're going to have to figure out where space low is. Like, if, you know, 11 kilometers is space high, then woof, that's going to be a very low orbit that we're going to need to do, but that's fine. We'll move on past that. There's no real reason to see me adjust my orbit just slightly for science sake. But yeah, just a couple more things of science to do before we try to move this on to Deimos, and if not, then we will, I don't know, not sure what else I would do with this thing, but that is where we will leave this one for now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition of the Lunar Skiff spacecraft on a Paladin 3 launcher that is taking us to the moon to prepare for the first landing of a crew on the lunar surface. Yes, indeed, we have a Paladin 3 here. my most powerful rocket to date on 5 E1 engines in a kind of a mock-up of what our Saturn V analog is going to end up looking like. But yes, we are on our way on our most powerful rocket, sending up 2 spacecraft in a configuration that is kind of my own thing and has evolved in a very, how do you put it, organic way from the way that the actual NASA space program decided on the way that they were going to get to the moon. So, as you see, the mission profile that we have here is we are sending out in a fully a single launch. We are sending up a spacecraft that is roughly analogous with a Saturn 1B, kind of. It's more of a Saturn C3, almost, sort of. Like, it's somewhere in between those two things as far as capability, because 5 E1 engines is pretty analogous to the 8 H1s, maybe a little bit more powerful. But yeah, definitely a little bit more powerful than that. But in any case, it's kind of a similar architecture. So let me step back. When NASA was planning for their lunar launches and deciding on Project Apollo, and keep in mind this was before Mercury had even taken off yet. Like, they were planning this well in advance. They had a couple different ideas for how they might get to the moon. One of the ideas was the direct ascent. That was sending like one gigantic spacecraft that would be the service module and the return module and the lander all in one kit with no separation, no docking, and therefore it would be really relatively simple. The downside is that they would have to use a rocket that was known as the Nova, which is kind of like just a supersized Saturn V. So it would be something like a 8 F1 engines on the first stage instead of 5, and then 8 J2 engines on the second stage instead of 5. And then the third stage and on is the same with 1 J2 and then the actual payload module on top. So this thing would be humongous, absolutely atrociously huge, and that would make that a little bit more expensive. So that is the downside to direct ascent, is that you could put all of it on one thing, but it would be one humongous thing indeed. And we have ignition of our second stage, and we continue our push towards orbit. Another option, and one that was very compatible with Gemini, and what is actually as close to our current profile as anything else, is the Earth orbit rendezvous. So what this plan was to send up basically a translunar injection stage, a S4B, so just basically one of not this one, but kind of the analog of this stage here, where it would have the 1J2, that is the third stage of a Saturn V rocket. So basically you could put one of those into orbit with a full tank of fuel, and then dock with that a lander and service module combo. So basically imagine launching the boost stage that the Saturn that the Apollo architecture docked with to move on towards the moon. Imagine that you launched that in one, and then you launched the Saturn V top stage as a separate thing, and then you connected those, and then they boosted on towards the moon. The way that I've seen that is in Buzz Aldrin's Space Program Manager, which I know I talk about quite a bit, especially with these theoretical architectures. But the way that one worked is that you would send up the Gemini capsule with a trans stage and also the lander tucked in underneath it, and they had like really cool art for how this looked, and I might include a picture of that. But the way that looked was super neat, and it was just using the tiny light Langley lander. So it had to be a lot lighter than what I'm sending now. But in any case, they set that up to dock with this S4B upper stage rocket that would then push it towards the moon, and then the Gemini spacecraft would take care of things from there. So there was an Apollo proposal that was kind of similar to that, where they would send up 2 rockets on a modified Saturn somewhere kind of similar to what I have here, and then they would go out towards the moon and then conduct the mission. Pretty similar to what I have. I decided to send 2 of these modified Saturn rockets also, so it's the same cost roughly, but what it does is it sends out first, this lander is just going to go get into orbit of the moon, and then I'm going to send the Gemini spacecraft out to meet it. And the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, which is, you know, some kind of combination thereof, is it's grown organically from the fact that I already have the Gemini lunar orbit module that is able to get there and come back completely on its own power with an extra delta V. So the Earth orbit rendezvous is pretty close to what I'm doing, but different in a lot of ways. The third option that NASA considered is obviously the one that they took. That would be lunar orbit rendezvous, where they would send a single rocket with a service module, crew, and lander in one package, leave that service module in orbit while the lander goes down to the surface of the moon, and then it comes back up and rendezvous in lunar orbit for the return trip. That is exactly what the Saturn V Apollo mission was, and I'm using a little bit of this and a little bit of the Earth orbit rendezvous mission architecture in my current plan. So the Earth orbit rendezvous I've heard referred to as EOR, so Earth orbit rendezvous EOR, and LOR, because there's an Earth orbit rendezvous and then there's a lunar orbit rendezvous of the lander and the service module once again, which I assume refers to the fact that there's a rendezvous in both places. So what I'm doing is basically an LOR. So there's 2 lunar orbit rendezvous that happen. All of the rendezvous happens in orbit of the moon. I don't know. This sounds like it might actually be a relatively inefficient profile. It sounds like I could probably, like, if I put in the work, I could probably come up with an architecture that meets up a, what do you call it? This lunar lander with the service module and gets them both out towards the moon with one full trans stage that I've put into orbit. Like, I could probably get something like that, like, because I could then reduce the amount of delta V on this thing because it doesn't need to catch me into orbit and all of that. And yeah, like, I could probably do that, but I already had the Gemini lunar module, so I'd already done that part of the equation, and so this actually became, because of that, a simpler architecture for me to build because I already had half of it done. So all of that rambled on about. Let's get on or towards the moon. So we're going to not do an advanced transfer, but just a regular transfer that can impact the moon, and I don't care about that because we are going to be indeed trashing this lower stage. So let's just get ourselves into, there we go, that's the direction we want to come in. There we go. So that's kind of what we're looking for. I'd like to smash this stage into the moon because it is not going to be useful to us. So we can execute that node. So yeah, this is probably going to be, if not the end of the Gemini program for me, it's going to be pretty darn close to it. I can shut down this avionics for now and shut down this habitat, just conserve what power I can, and the lithium hydroxide scrubber can be shut off as well. Yeah, so just conserve power before the crew actually gets there. But yeah, this is pretty close to the end of the Gemini program for me. Like, this has been a wildly successful Gemini, and we have really delved into some Gemini Advanced concepts, which has been a ton of fun. I love these Gemini Advanced concepts and finding ways to extend this part of our space program, because there's really no reason not to, right? Like, there's nothing that Apollo does that Gemini can't do in terms of RP-1 design and architecture. So yeah, there's really no reason not to do what we're doing, because it allows us to finish these contracts early. The fact that I'm still more than a decade late notwithstanding, I am, yeah, well, not more than a decade. I'm about 6 years late for a lunar landing period, but you know, that's fine. We're making it happen one way or the other, and that's lovely. Why do I have no crew control? I think it's probably because I don't have. It's very much complaining about not having a crew in the lander can, but I have tested it, and per my tests, this does work without the additional avionics, which I had an avionics ring on here, or module on here that I used to deal with the fact that there was going to be no crew, but because I've tested that without it, it seems to work just fine, so fingers crossed that that is still the case. Because we are doing this now, and we are pushing on towards the moon, and then I don't have any information on that there. Yeah, we have just 3 days, a little bit less than 4 days, until the Gemini 8L is rolled out to the pad, and then that will be launching out to meet this vessel, which has nothing that is perishable, necessarily. It should have plenty of power. One of the only tweaks that I made between this and the test version that I launched is I upgraded the solar panels to tech level 2 because they're better in every single way. They're lighter, generate more power, and also cost less because the new solar panel technology is amazing and it makes me so happy. So yeah, that is what I've done. I've also upgraded the tech level of the antenna to level 5 from level 4. But that's really it. Like, I thought about kind of like tweaking the amount of fuel that I have, but I'm pretty confident that my architecture works because I did some really stupid stuff on my dress rehearsal mission, and it still worked out. Like, I got into basically the wrong orbit. One thing that I did is when I did this mission originally, I got myself into my kind of standard 150 kilometer lunar orbit to make that be the parking orbit before we come down to into a lunar landing trajectory, but that's still really high. Like, you can put on a lot of velocity if you're dropping straight down from a lunar trajectory at 150 kilometers. So yeah, we really don't want that. So 30 kilometers is what I would like to get to. But first, we want to make sure that this thing collides with the surface of the moon. There we go. Put that right in there. Fantastic. And now we are going to prepare our lander as we just now come into the sun. Fantastic. I like the little blush of sunset on there, or sunrise. Cool. So yeah, we are going to now that is all ready, we can extend our fancy new solar panels. Extendo. And it's time to say farewell to our transfer stage. So, turn our avionics back on, and we do indeed have control. So yes, the lander can does act as avionics, even if you do not have a crew on board, which is fantastic. I definitely don't have a crew on board, do I? Okay, good. Which is not something that I've found to be true of the Gemini pod, or the Apollo pod, actually. So that has been a massive problem for me, but that is not something that is the case with the this lander, which is just fantastic. So, oops, hold on. Careful with where we actually end up here. Let's push out a little bit radial so that we come away from our transfer stage. There we go. Now I have much more free reign to push just a little bit retrograde, and I'm just looking for about 30 kilometers. That's really it. That is incredibly terrifyingly low, I'm fully aware, but that is going to help us out a lot in everything else that we are going to be doing with this landing, because I am cutting it incredibly tight with this the amount of fuel that I have on this, because I'm using the lunar landing engine with its 3 burns, and I'm using all 3 of those burns. Burn 1, we are going to be inserting into lunar orbit. So this one here, about 800 meters per second, which leaves us with 1800 meters per second of delta V, and you need about 1750 to actually perform a landing. So I need all the help that I can get. So that's what we're going to be looking at here, and that should be just fine. Yep, and then we are going to have the our Gemini L come in to meet this spacecraft. And you can see our separated booster moving away and heading up slightly faster than we are on its way towards the moon to impact the surface. And you can see what the difference is between our trajectories, because it is like a half of a meter per second, like 0.2 meters per second, just a little bit slower. So yeah, there we go. Let's go ahead and put on a timer for when we enter into the sphere of influence of the moon. We are pointed roughly at the sun, so that is good for that. With the avionics off, we have perpetual power pointed in this direction, so we should be all set so long as we do not move. All right, so now it's time to get on towards the moon. All right, so heading out in the direction of the moon, we are on our way. We have about 3 days, almost 4 days, until we arrive on the surface of the moon. So let's just start moving our way out there. Not the surface of the moon. We've got a little bit longer until we get there. We want to make sure that we have actually, launched our crewed payload first. But yeah, so we are heading out there, and this is basically what we have. This has not fired up the engine on here yet, which, as I've mentioned, is the Lunar Module Descent Engine that I am using to also circularize into the orbit, or insert into the orbit of the moon. So we will be using that as well, because it's a pretty decent engine. It's not like amazing, but it's also really not that bad. It's got a specific impulse of none of your business, I guess. We can take a look at that, but yeah, the way that I've planned this one out is that we have enough delta V here, just barely, to circularize or insert into lunar orbit very, very low, and then go ahead and descend down to the surface on this stage here, which ideally will have a Kerbal in it. So I'm pretty sure I accounted for all of that, but I guess we will see. Yeah, so that is what we have coming in. We are coming into the sphere of influence of the moon just now. There it goes. It's happening. There we go. Okay, sure, whatever. So yeah, there we go. So this lander is about 12.5 tons, so I'm kind of splitting the difference between the lander, the actual Apollo lander, and the Langley Light lander, the little tiny one that was basically just a external command seat that I just couldn't get to work when I tried to make one myself. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So now that we are here, yep, that's looking pretty decent. I'm going to fire up, I'm just using RCS to kind of correct our trajectory, because I really want this to be down as low as possible. So a 30 kilometer trajectory, or lunar periaps, is exactly what I am looking for here. So, got just a little bit more to do, and there we go. Perfect. That will do just fine. And then I can just use MacLeod to do the other half of this for me, because I am a lazy man. And there we go. So yeah, that's going to cost us another 784 meters per second, and that's going to leave us with not a ton of delta V, but like I said, it should be just a little bit over what we are going to need to land safely on the surface. And from a 30 kilometer altitude, that's actually not so bad. It's just something that you have to do very, very carefully when you have something as low thrust to weight ratio as this. The fact that it burns this entire bit of delta V in 500 seconds, that is an eternity when you are trying to land. So we'll just execute that node and we start rotating around. And like I said, for whatever reason, the avionics on this seems to work just fine without a crew on board. I wonder if that's still true for the, what do you call it? The replica version, the lunar excursion module, the LEM. So yeah, because I don't know why that was the case for the, I want to say it was Gemini that I tried that on the first time, but maybe it was Mercury. But in any case, it's a problem that I've had a couple of times, but hopefully it is not one that is going to trouble us too much here. So yeah, this part of the mission, relatively simple. We are just getting this thing into orbit and ready for crew to come and execute the remainder of the mission. Here we come, just hurtling down really low over the surface of the moon, and I'm realizing now that in adjusting things around, I have gotten our Paraloon a bit lower than I had intended. So I fired it up anyways, and we're going to have an even lower orbit. I'll probably tweak this up so that it's not quite so low. But you can see that this is a nice, a pretty efficient engine at 311, which is about as good as you can get with Aerozine and NTO. I think there's one engine like the, what do you call it? The gigantic one that the service module for Apollo uses is one that has, I think, 315, but this is about the number that we would expect for engines of this type. And the nice thing is that this has 44 kilonewtons of thrust, roughly, and it's throttleable. That's the big part. That is not something that is shared on very many engines at all, and so it kind of limits what you can do with for landing engines. So I've found that that's been a big limiting factor. Like either you use generic thrusters or something and just kind of flutter the throttle, or because the engines that would be efficient enough and powerful enough to act as landing engines are often not throttleable, or they have limited ignitions, and that makes it very difficult to choose what engines that you would want to use, because like a lot of them are just not usable for that. One engine that I'm really interested in using is that there's an RL10 3-3 Lunex configuration, which, as I understand it, was a proposal for a potential moon lander. I don't know if it was a Gemini or Apollo moon landing proposal, but I know it was kind of in that general region. But yeah, a throttleable RL-10, that sounds amazing. I could definitely have used that, but I didn't want to deal too much with, MLI layers and so forth. That would have increased the weight and made this a little bit harder to do. But and also the tankage would have been humongous to get the same amount of delta V. So yeah, that's something that I'm planning on playing with a little bit later on. But for now, we are coming down into our lower orbit of the moon, taking as much advantage of the Oberth effect as you possibly could. But yeah, we are coming in, and as I mentioned, this thing is a kind of a compromise between the Langley Light Lander and the full Apollo LEM, because it has a full science kit on it. Like, maybe not full, but it has some. Doesn't it have more experiments? I thought for sure it had more experiments than this thing actually seems to, but well, I guess I don't have much. I just have the soil sampler scoop on the bottom here. I thought for sure I'd put a whole bunch more science on this thing, or maybe some up in here. I don't know. I guess not. Maybe that was a different version, like the uncrewed version might have had a bunch of experiments in the little avionics ring up on top. But that is that. We are in a 23 by 15. Ugh, that's a little too low. I'm going to flip this around, and we are going to raise our orbit just a tiny bit, because that's a little bit terrifying. There's a limit to how much benefit you can get from orbiting low, and smashing into the side of a mountain is about that limit, if you ask me. Alright, I've pushed our Apolloon up to 30 kilometers, and our Paraloon is at about 18, which doesn't look like it touches the surface anywhere. And we are pretty close to our Paraloon at the moment, so I think we're okay. But you know, just to be safe, let's orbit around, and we are going to. Man, that just feels so low. But yeah, we are going to orbit around. I'm now close to my Apolloon, and we are just going to fix this orbit, and we are going to do it with RCS only, because you see, I only have one ignition remaining. One ignition remaining. Why is there only one ignition remaining? There should be two. Okay, so I don't know what happened, but I must have accidentally fired up the engine a second time or something. I screwed up. I should have two ignitions left, but I only have the one. So this is going to be even more of a suicide burn than I had expected. What that means is that instead of having a Paraloon lowering burn to start the descent, I'm going to have to like go immediately into it and go straight from orbit into landing, which is not how I wanted to do that. That makes it a lot harder for me to plan exactly where my terminal burn is going to be. That is going to drop us into a particular biome, but I think that should be okay. This should be survivable. But yeah, knowing that there's only one ignition left on here is very good to know, because that is a dangerous complication to our mission that I probably just fat-fingered at some point when I was fussing around with MechJab earlier. So that's what you get doing that, I suppose. But yeah, so anyways, this is what we are looking for now. So this is going to sit in orbit. We are actually now talking through LunaNet 2-1 is the, you can actually see right here, that is the craft that we are communicating home through. So that means that our ComSat network is operational and will be so for a while. If you hadn't seen all that discussion before, these are set up in an orbit such that they are not going to fall out of sync for probably several thousand years, apparently, because they are put into orbit with millisecond precision, like they're 0.02 seconds away from each other in orbital period, which means they are going to not drift much at all, which is perfect. So they're going to stay exactly where they are and provide good communication. So I'm really happy that that worked. You can see now, because we are on the far side of the moon, where there's nice sunny weather, but that means that even over here we have perfect communications back home. We can get signal, we can land properly, and do all of those wonderful things. So that is highly successful, and I am really happy about it. So we are going to leave that there, and now it's time to launch the Gemini spacecraft to meet up with this. But that is all the time I am going to have for this episode. We will get on to the rest of this moon landing mission, which turned out to be a pretty epic thing after all, in the next episode. So if you enjoyed this one, please like and subscribe. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.